Hey, everybody. Sorry, it is my fault for being late. I clicked on the international link and that took me down a whole rabbit trail, so I apologize. Welcome to week 96 of the weekly webinar, and you will not need your decoder ring. Thank goodness Jack Santaniello is on and he has the themed background. That's awesome. And Adam, I think, has a teed up rant. So we're going to go ahead and throw it right over to him. You guys know the drill. Hit us up on the Q&A for questions and you can harass us on the chat. So Adam, here you go.
I got you. Well, I appreciate that, Gary. Yeah, a couple things this week before we get into the meat and potatoes of the webinar. First, we had a client that has been having issues with Bank of America with their PPP loan forgiveness, and it's a small loan, so in theory, it's one of those just should be an automatic pass because it's below $150,000. Yet Bank of America is giving them the business, so to say. If you're a Leave It to Beaver fan, I should have given out a coffee card on that one. If anybody could ask what giving them the business came from. And, it comes down to, at the end of the day, the person messed up in their application, included some independent contractors in terms of getting the loan amount, but then actually spent the money for proper and valid purposes on payroll, not independent contractors. So, they're getting, and it's still below the $150,000. So they've been getting the business from Bank of America. Got other clients that have been in similar situations with other banks that have had no problems. Bank of America is going like this. The SBA is going like this. No, it's Bank of America. They've gotten their Congress people involved. Congress people are like, we don't know what to do here. So we gave them an idea on what they could do to fix the problem, which would be, amend a couple tax returns to reflect what really should have happened, even if that costs some Social Security taxes to do so. And we're fully prepared to do that as a firm. But where this is going is that what's funny about this with Bank of America specifically, no offense to Bank of America, is that, as I'm driving home the other day, listening to NPR, what pops on as a story, Gary? But the Facebook groups that have cropped up of Bank of America small PPP loan recipients who have had the exact same problem in the exact same runaround, which is now numbering in the thousands in terms of the Facebook group. Wow. So I just thought, because I'm thinking, it's just an isolated case. And then lo and behold, I'm just, cruising down the road and hear this thing on NPR. So if you've experienced that, either on the call or know anybody, I don't know what to say other than to say, hey, you're not alone, and you're not crazy. There's other groups contemplating class action lawsuits and whatnot out there because of this. But so that's rant on Bank of America. Rant on the state of North Carolina. Let me start off by saying, before I go on the rant, generally, I am proud to be from the Tar Heel state right now, because what I'm really happy that I don't have to see on the nightly national news? The state of North Carolina featured for something crazy going on. Whether it's a school board shooting, trying to pass something in the legislature that's just kooky dukes, whatever it is. Like, as much as I knock our state, we're not being featured for anything related to an election, a mask, or a vaccine. It's like, God bless us for that. God bless Governor Cooper. God bless the General Assembly for not having us be in the news. But all that said, one of the things that does drive me crazy about our General Assembly and our governor is the North Carolina tax code, and specifically, this happened with the PPP expenses. Hey, we're not going to adopt the federal code because that would cost us some, tax dollars, but then we're going to run around and say, we need to help people out. Well, the latest gotcha is we're filing our North Carolina tax returns that, I don't know how we all missed this, but evidently we did. So as part of the CARES Act, as a way, or it wasn't the CARES Act, it was the subsequent legislation, they thought, hey, maybe a way to incentivize people to spend more money at restaurants and bars is to allow 100% deductibility of meals and entertainment. It used to be, normally it's 50%. You mean with the theory that if I take Jack out to lunch, I was going to have to buy lunch for myself anyway, therefore I cannot deduct my meal. That's the theory of how that 50% thing came about. Well, hey, as an incentive to try to get people to go out more, you can argue whether it was a good incentive or not. I don't know, but they allowed for 100% deductibility at the federal level. And, pretty much every state in the country piggybacks off the federal code, not North Carolina. So while we're all boo-hoo-hooing about our restaurants and, hey, we need to get back there and offer some sort of economic incentive and, blah, 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 we're not going to allow for deductibility of meals and entertainment at 100%. It's only going to be 50%. Therefore, it's going to be an add back to your North Carolina tax return. Don't tell anybody though. But by the way, we believe in lower taxes. It's just, it's freaking ridiculous and complicating. And, is it that big of a deal, to a lot of our clients? If you think about it this way, I mean, if I just look at BGW as an example, we're probably going to spend, round numbers, probably $100,000 on meals and entertainment. That if it was only 50%, that times the tax code is about $15,000. It's $2,500. What did that cost? It cost $2,500. Like the state of North Carolina is getting $2,500 extra more dollars out of the BGW ownership team by not piggybacking on the federal code. Is that changing my policy of like how much I'm going to spend on meals one way or the other? Probably not. But I just find it extremely disingenuous when somebody says, I'm going to give you a tax cut, but then not piggyback on a tax cut. Mic drop.
So first question on that, is that 2020 or 2022 or 2023 meals at 50% for North Carolina?
It's 2021, so it's happening now. So that this last year as we're filing tax returns, like, hey team, what's this add back that's happening on the North Carolina returns? Oh.
Well, since Robert was the first one in, he did, his first question to us was, can we add an economist to the weekly call to ask when inflation will end? Perhaps is out of scope. Well, so, and Adam, I want you to give your opinion, but first I'm going to look into the Crystal BGW pint glass. And it's telling me that inflation is going to end. Battery just went out.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I actually have a Magic 8-Ball app on my phone that when my 16-year-old asks me a question that's really stupid that I probably should say no to, I just say, well, I don't know. Let's consult the Magic 8-Ball. To answer that question, Robert, I think what's hard to parse out of this from an inflation. So the answer to that is, in terms of going up in double digits, I think that's got to go away sometime. When I say go away, if the government doesn't step in, then you can pretty much all but guarantee that the Democrats will not be in power anymore. And then that ideally should be job number one for the Republicans if the Democrats don't fix it sooner rather than later. But so I feel like, will the government step in and try to take some action sometime before the November midterms or sometime shortly thereafter? Yeah. So I think, in terms of as bad as it is now, do I see that coming down in the next, 6 months to a year? Absolutely. But I think what has not been factored in that I don't know what the overall effect is, but I don't think the labor component of inflation is going down. So if you just look at the BTW clientele, like as bad at, as much as I hate that this is true, it is true that we had to inflate our prices. Why do we have to inflate our prices? Because to keep our people, we had to do, pretty close to, 15 to 20%, salary bumps just to keep them, because that's what the market's doing right now in terms of labor, to attract labor. I mean, that's across, that same thing's happening in Amazon. It's happening in McDonald's. It's like, if you just translate that into what does that mean for BGW, labor and benefits are roughly, 60% of our costs. So you take, 15% times 60%, that's the price increase that we would have to do just to stay whole, if nothing else changed without going backwards, we didn't raise prices that much. So we ate some of it, but I'm not gonna be able to go back to the team and say, hey, I want to let you know that inflation's been coming down, so I'm gonna need to take that pay increase back to get back in line with where inflation. That's just not gonna. So I just feel like there's a sense of permanence that exists in the price increase associated with the labor element specifically that we're not getting back. I mean, it probably won't continue to increase at the same accelerated rate, but I think there's just an element of like, it's stuck. I mean, if you just think about, well, what's the price of milk, Jack? That's going to be the leading indicator. Well, I mean, there's lots of components that go into that, but historically it's like, okay, petroleum products, maybe some raw materials, but labor is a part of that. And the labor is not going to go down, I don't think.
Yeah. Speaking of price increases, like, isn't it interesting that, gasoline prices went through the roof last year, and yet they had taken the mileage deduction down. It was 56 cents a mile in 2021. Now they've jumped it up 2.5 cents for 2022. But I found that to be really interesting because, like, well, fuel just went up 50%. And you drop the standard reimbursement rate. So, all right. Well, we've had good rants and good questions already, but one of the reasons that we're going to do this today, and the reason it's M&A war stories, is, and we're trying to decipher some of these legal documents that can, hang you up, man. I mean, as they say, what you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. In this case, what you sign can and will be used against you if you aren't paying attention. So, Jack, you don't even have normally I thought you were an Under Armour guy, but now you've got the Nike swoosh. It must be for the Olympics or something. I don't know, but
yeah. So morning. Yeah, I was like, okay, I'll put this one on. It's nice and comfy and cozy. So yeah, I'm not a brand snob. I'm an equal opportunity purchaser. So before we go into those things, there are speaking of taking things back. So the two things. One is on the employee retention tax credit, that there continues to be discussion about bringing it back. And they're saying that because the Omicron variant has triggered a surge in cases, and small businesses and nonprofits are lobbying to get the aid back. But what I didn't know until seeing this article was some of the numerics, and it was in the fall when they said September is the cutoff for the tax credit. It generated $8.2 billion in revenue for the federal government. And then, they said they made the statement after the fact, so it was retroactive. So that's the part of, hey, we're going to take it back. And I think there are probably cases where the money was received or the money was kind of utilized, and now you have an issue going into this year and dealing with that. So the other is the budget and putting that together. And so right now there is a budget, federal budget, that are a longer term spending bill that goes through March 11th. And House members are out of Washington until February 28th. And so they have essentially they're going to be out, and they have until the 18th. So they have a little more than a week to basically get all their act together, or there's going to be another Russian hustle to get that done. So, are they going to band-aid it again and put some money into the hopper and say, we'll deal with it in April or May? Are they really going to come to some conclusions and really set the budget? There's so many things that are going on with the federal government with respect to money and money policy and everything else that there's really no way to tell exactly what they're going to do or even handicap it. So just wanted to bring up those two things that people have been asking me over the course of the last week or so. So, and if we want to go ahead and get into kind of the core of it, I don't know if you want to go forward with it, or do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll save Robert's question
Yeah, I just saw
at
that.
the
Yes.
end.
Yeah. Okay. So essentially, we're talking about kind of M&A Morse code, and the concept being is, what is all that legal mumbo jumbo in those asset purchase agreements and the stock purchase agreements, and how to kind of get through them. And really, there are fundamental portions of those documents. And while they are, it's a similar cadence, whether it's a stock purchase or asset purchase. Now, obviously, the terms and conditions are a little bit different, but the concepts are very similar. And as a much smarter man than me told me many years ago, and reiterated it last week in a seminar for the business lawyers in North Carolina, that you go to the back of the document, meaning that everything's great. I mean, the front of the document, it's like, what are the transaction terms? Who's going to get paid? When are they going to get paid? What form payment, et cetera. But what happens when bad things happen? So you go to look at the termination provisions. So that's kind of like the back end of these documents, where you go, okay, who can terminate it, under what circumstances, and then what's the results of the termination. And that varies depending on the transaction. Then you look at how do you fund the bad things that occur either because of the termination or happen after the fact. So you go and look at the indemnity provisions. So you have an indemnity, essentially is an obligation that a party has to basically be an insurance policy on whatever they are promising, guaranteeing essentially. But then you have, in most cases, an escrow or a holdback on the purchase price that is the funding mechanism for those things. Now, in recent years, there's been this concept of rep and warranty insurance that basically is exactly what it sounds like, which is the party, typically the seller, is making all these representations and warranties as to, and we'll talk about that next, because that's kind of like the next chunk if we're going from back to front in a document, is what is the insurance policy. And so it's a substitute insurance policy, that is, if somebody says something or does something or misrepresents, then there's an actual insurance policy in place. So you look at all those things, and then the boilerplate as well, like governing law, and is it mediation, is it arbitration? So those kind of things you look at, which are important. Where are you gonna, do you have home court advantage, or are you going to be somewhere else? Is it going to be arbitration? What are the rules? And a lot of that stuff just is like, and lawyers do this all the time. They're just, okay, yeah, it was good on the last transaction, so it must be okay. Or the other side put it in there, it doesn't really matter. Well, in a lot of cases, it does matter. So, I don't like using the term boilerplate, because there's really no such thing in a transaction document. And then kind of going again in reverse order, the middle part, kind of the core of a transaction document, like a stock purchase agreement or an asset purchase agreement, is really what is being said as the status quo. And it's usually the seller, whether it's the company that's being sold or the assets being sold, are saying, okay, here is the state of the world and everything is wonderful. We have no employee issues. We have no tax issues. We have no environmental issues. Here are our tax returns and they are accurate. We've had no audits. We've had, so all of these things that are being represented. And I also add, and that probably past 5 or 6 years, things regarding representations regarding data privacy and data breaches, which are important to know. And so you have all these things, and then you have an opportunity to put these exceptions into what you're saying is true. So, and those are called schedules, disclosure schedules. So you're disclosing exceptions to the representations that you're making into the transaction. So yes, our tax records are fantastic, and But we had an audit in 2019. It was a random audit and everything turned out fine. We have no litigation. However, about a week ago, an employee came to us and said, I feel like that there's been some discrimination, or maybe I was passed over for a job. And so now you have knowledge of a potential litigious matter that has to be disclosed. And there are disclosures for the buyers as well, but that list is pretty short typically. And then related to that, you have representations and warranties, and then you have covenants, which are promises that you're making during the transaction and things that you're going to do post-closing. A typical covenant is, I, seller, am not going to do anything outside of the ordinary course of business that is different than, or outside ordinary course of business, meaning different than what I'm already doing. I'm not going to pull money out. I'm not going to go buy new equipment. I'm not going to hire 10 new people. Or if I do that, before I do it, I will ask for permission to do that because it's an anomaly. So things like that, that I promise that you will have me available as the former CEO to work for you for free for 90 days. And how many hours is that? So you get into those kind of things. Then when you're moving forward, or backwards essentially, but moving towards the front, then you have the transaction terms. So you have, okay, these are the assets that are being sold. These are and you go through and there's categories, whether it's equipment, whether it is contracts, etc. And then you have excluded assets, which is things that are not being sold. Yeah, that's my grandfather's desk in my office that is really nice and I want to keep it. Or, for example, in car dealerships that we've sold or bought, my clients either want to keep an automobile that they have, or want the ability to be able to get a new vehicle once per year as the former owner of that franchised automobile location. And so all those things get negotiated. And then you have excluded liabilities in an asset purchase transaction where it says or either assume liabilities and excluded liabilities. So things that are going to be assumed. So let's say you have contracts that are in process. Well, you assume those contracts, but then you also assume the liabilities. And then there's nuances like, okay, what if it's a contract that's been performed or goods have been sold and there's a warranty related to that? And then who gets dinged for the cost of the warranty work, et cetera. So, and so really, that is, and then in a stock purchase, a little bit different, but then you have representations related to the ownership of the stock. There's no liens on it, that, these are all the shareholders, that there's no other owners. You have in a stock purchase, the transaction, a key concept, net working capital. Okay, what are the requirements that when I as a buyer take over that business, that there has to be $1 million in the bank, cash in order, or cash equivalents, to be able to run the business on day one as me being the owner. And, so you go through all those things. So really, those are the two main documents essentially, and a very 30,000 foot level as to what I would say are the kind of the chunks, the chapters essentially in the main chapters in each of those agreements. And you have to be careful. And I say we as lawyers have to be careful that we tailor each of these agreements, even though there's a cadence and a pattern, that they really have to be specific to the transaction and to the people that are involved in the transaction. And a lot of times you'll, when we're representing a seller, well, let's talk conceptually, buyer and seller, who gets to draft a document? So in the first instance, well, typically the person who has the money and is putting up the money gets first shot at doing it. So typically the buyer is the one that's going to do it. And sometimes you have buyer's counsel who does exactly that, pulls something out of their forms library, spends a little bit of time on it, and then basically launches it to us. And then I have to have a discussion with our client and say, okay, this is not good. So do you want me to spend my time making it bleed blue and red? And I'm not talking about saying shareholder versus stockholder. I'm talking about pretty substantive issues that were missed that may even have been in the LOI that are very clear, black and white, that just didn't make it into the form. Or do we basically say we're going to use our form? And so, ultimately, you say, and you need to be careful, because in LOIs, it typically says who's going to do it, who's going to draft it. So many times my seller clients in an LOI take a leap of faith that the document that's coming from buyer and buyer's counsel is going to be at least initially sufficient as a starting point, as a foundation for the transaction. And sometimes that's not the case. And so you have to work through those issues. But so that is asset purchase agreement, stock purchase agreement 101, seriously, at a 30,000 foot level, because we could do a seminar on legal issues and the tax issues related to each of them for several days on each of them, because it does get that kind of sophisticated. So that's kind of the legal aspects. And so, Adam, I don't know if you want to get into kind of the
Before we do that,
yep.
I got to take one of these questions. And so I'm going to leave the person anonymous, as well as the broker anonymous, but basically they're meeting today with a investment banker, business broker type firm. And I know that there's a difference, Scott Upton. If you want to really offend him, call him a business broker. So anyway, but typically business brokers do a little bit smaller transactions and investment bankers do larger transactions, right? So, and this group kind of does a little bit of both. So anyway, they're going to go over their evaluation. We have a couple of parties interested in the business, so we'll try to sell direct before listing. What questions should I ask about the evaluation or otherwise? Ooh, that's timely. So any thoughts?
Yeah,
Adam.
I'll actually hit the next question, which is what is a typical model for analysis of anticipated cash flow for the buyer? Because they're both really a little bit related. I mean, I think kind of the primary question that I would want to know in anything is, and I know the Viking guys really well. They're going to give you a valuation, say, here's what we think that we could list it for and what you could get. Well, okay, got it. That's a gross sales price. Then there's their fee. There's taxes, depending on the structure. There may be, an amount that has to be, earned out just based on the nature of your business. So I think that, the question I'd be looking for is like, yeah, but what am I going to put in my pocket? And is that really enough for me to move on? And if not, what can I do to make it better, than what it is? I mean, that, there's obviously some process questions like what happens, what can I do to get ready? We've covered a lot of those in some of the previous seminars in terms of making sure your contracts are good, employment agreements are buttoned up, financials are in good working order, meaning like, I'm not going to have a lot of questions about them. Tax returns are easy to understand, all that kind of stuff. Like all that preparation stuff still matters. But I mean, at the end of the day, it really comes down to what am I putting in my pocket guaranteed and what's going to be at risk? That's really it. With respect to the interested parties, already direct, I mean, it still comes back to what am I going to put in my pocket ultimately? But, I think the other thing that I'd ask too, and I'd ask for kind of some live examples, is that, if the whole plan here is I'm selling the company and I'm walking away, meaning like I'm done, I have no interest beyond the 90 days Jack just talked about in being a part of anything, period. I'm ready to move on with my life. I want no part of being part of this organization going forward. I want it to be done and dusted. Honestly, the value of a company like Viking or, Scott Upton and ICG or, really anybody that's in that business is to run a process to maximize the amount you're going to put in your pocket, because you're only going to do this once. I mean, it's not like, like unless you're selling it seller financed and somebody defaults and you get to take the keys back, you're not going to sell this business again. So sort of like your house, like unless you're trying to sell it to somebody that you really, really want to have it, you might as well run a process and maximize the value. And I think that the challenge that you get into is that if you just go direct, I mean, you don't have a middleman that's really incentivized to drive up the value for you. So I just, so what I'd ask is like, look, I mean, Viking or somebody like that's going to charge probably between, 5 and 8%, for the transaction fee, and in theory, they should be able to get a multiple of that to pay for themselves in terms of driving up, the price by running a process. So I think the other question I'd ask is, look, if I've got a couple people who are already interested, what's the value you're going to bring to the party? If that's the case, because that should translate into ultimately, absolute dollars in your pocket. But if not absolute dollars, then at a minimum, tilting, stacking the deck to where it's more guaranteed money in your pocket than, earn out / seller financing / whatever the case may be.
So one of the follow-on questions about that was, do brokers highball to get the contract? And I'm going to add one other thing as you're thinking about that, where you let's say you do have a couple of interested parties and, think about it like selling your house. Wow. I did an open house. We actually ran into this when we had to move away from Charlotte a number of years ago. And we just bought this house in Ballantyne. Well, we were in it less than a year and we had to move. So I decided I'm going to try to sell it by owner. I had some interested parties, but I actually wanted a really good realtor to kind of, deal with all the hassle and all that kind of stuff. And so I negotiated a lower percentage with her because I said, if one of these interested parties comes through, will you cut your fee, appropriately? And she did. And that's what happened. So I don't know if that can be done. I haven't heard that,
I mean, if you can, most people, if you've already got interested parties, and you're still interested in running a process, if it's one of the interested parties that ends up being the ultimate winner of the process, they'll waive part of the fee associated with that. But in terms of the other question around, hey, they're just going to highball the valuation to get the work, the answer to that is people are oftentimes fearful of that, but my experience has been, no, they don't. Now, if you've got garbage going into the process and then they kick out a valuation that you're not happy with, I mean, you just need to look at yourself in the eye and say, well, that's my own problem. Like I gave them the garbage that then gave them the answer. So once you exclude that out, the way whether, and I got to give if I don't give my brother-in-law a shout out, he's going to kill me. He also is in the business with Quest, but the way that all these companies generally work is they want to get a deal done. And the only way to get a deal done is to, produce a deal that's financeable. So what that means, like if you look at like a traditional deal that's going to be financed by the SBA, what does that really mean? Well, what that means is, first off, there's going to have to be an independent third-party valuation that demonstrates that the value of the company exceeds the purchase price. So right out of the gate, they have to be realistic. Otherwise, the deal is not going to get financed. So like, even if Viking says, hey, we think the value is $1 million, if they can't get a third party to agree to that, that's independent, they're dead in the water right out of the gate because the SBA is not going to look at it. So that's number one. Number two is, SBA typical term is going to be 7 to 10 years, and the deal has to cash flow. So the deal has to produce enough operating cash flow to finance that debt, which is ultimately, kind of an indicator of value. Otherwise, the deal's not going to get done. If it's a bigger transaction that's going to be more private equity or strategic buyer, somebody that's in that space, that's more in the investment brokerage space, is going to know what kind of firms would typically buy a company like yours. And they're going to give you a value that they know that they can probably get it sold. Cause it's like, why would I highball it? If you just think about it from the other direction, why would I highball it? Because if I highball it and it doesn't sell, I'm not going to get freaking paid. Like I'm going to produce a valuation that means that it's going to get sold. And it's like, I, as the person sitting down hearing that, may not be happy about the value, but that's not generally going to be the M&A person's fault. That's going to be just the reality of your business may not be worth that much. As much as you were hoping for. I mean, a good way to think about it is like, look, I mean, if you just want to go ghetto math, take your last tax return, company bottom line, ordinary box one income times 5 or 6. I mean, that's kind of your, that's your relevant range. If you just want to back of the scratch pad, there you go. Just save you $15,000. I mean, there's a lot of nuances that you can, you do within that, but, plus or minus 25%, that's going to be your relevant range, that you're going to be in. If it's a bigger company, it's going to be more than that multiple. If it's a smaller company, it's going to be a little bit less than that multiple, but there's your relevant range. And I'm sorry if that's not the answer you were looking for, but that is the freaking answer.
Well, and since we're telling war stories, I'll tell you one from last week that's been going on for a couple of weeks, which is pricing an engagement letter for an investment banker. And this particular client, who you guys are familiar with, by the way, has been toying with offers and or valuations, and not necessarily official valuations, but just numbers that were thrown out there. And then he had an IB that threw out a significantly higher number. And so it obviously piqued his interest. He's like, okay, but the way that we kind of tempered that, which was have a set number, a set fee up to a certain dollar amount, and then have a percentage that overrides that in the excess. So that, okay, what is fair if we get a value of a company, if my client gets a certain value and gets a certain purchase price, this is what you're going to get paid. But if you can literally put the money where your mouth is, then you'll get paid more. So there's the incentive, but it's also protective of a fee that gives them a minimum fee that they're okay with, but also is like, okay, a fee that the seller is okay with. And then if you get more, then you'll get more out of the transaction. So it's and this isn't the first time that this has happened. In this instance, we signed the engagement letter earlier this week, and everybody's happy with the formula that we came up with. But in prior instances, we've had the investment banker come back and say, "Yeah, I can't do that. We're not going to set a dollar amount and then go in excess." And the reason why was because the percentage at that purchase price was going to exceed, the fees that they would get using a percentage would exceed the cap for the sales price, if that makes sense. And so, interesting ways to do things like that. Another key also is to understand what the broker gets money on. And so is it just cash? Is it inclusive of, if money is used to pay down debt, and have interesting discussions as to conceptually that, well, is it, and this ends up being the difference between getting paid on enterprise value or cash that comes into the transaction that ends up in a seller's pocket. And so the perspective of getting a totally lien-free company and assets versus knowing that they're encumbered and having to use part of the purchase price to pay it off, similar to you do a mortgage on a house. If you're buying a house, part of the purchase proceeds the seller has to use to pay off the mortgage so you can get it free and clear, or that your lender can get the lien on the property. So there are various ways to temper, but you need to ask those questions as to what is the, in this instance, called the aggregate consideration, which is more than just the money that the seller is going to receive. And we did some carve outs because we don't know if it's going to be an asset sale or a stock sale. So in a stock sale, we said, well, if there is money that is left in the business, but it's because of working capital or a post-closing adjustment. So let's say that I was talking about a little while ago about money that is held back in escrow. What about the scenario where the money that is used, there's a claim, and it's because the working capital, the actual working capital was actually lower than what it was supposed to be at the time of closing. And so there's a post-closing adjustment where the seller has to pay some money. And if you're not careful in the engagement letter, and in this case, it did read that way, that all of the escrowed funds are part of the aggregate consideration, even though some of it was used to true up the working capital, which to me is a purchase price adjustment. That's not for paying for a misrepresentation or for whatever other bad thing happened. And so the insurance policy is being kicked, being pulled from. This is a purchase price adjustment. It's not fair, I don't think. And please don't tell Jay I said this, but I don't think it's fair that the broker should get a piece of something that is an adjustment to the purchase price. Because if you were doing straight math and go back and say, well, let's pretend like the adjustment occurred at the time of closing, what's the true consideration at that point, and then apply the percentage or whatever the fee is to that. So again, little nuances, but just some suggestions to get you through the kind of the negotiation with your broker, but also in anticipation of the type of transaction and what the purchase price might be.
All right, so I'm going to tee up a question for you guys to think of while I tee up this other question. But the question I want you to think about on a war story is anyone that that's been on the sell side that thought that certain things wouldn't be found out, may have been on a brown field. There could have been other things that they didn't talk about that, you get far down the pipe, on the thing, and then all of a sudden this rears its ugly head and either blows the deal or, negatively impacts it. So think about if you've got a war story on that. But a very specific question on this one was, hey, I'm obligated to pay $5,000 for an evaluation, haven't signed a listing contract. And if I remember right, the way that a lot of those work is, yeah, you pay a $5,000 fee and then it's discounted if they are able to consummate the deal for you. The question is, does BGW offer similar services? So Adam, you want to handle that one?
Yeah, we do. But I mean, typically, again, knowing Jay pretty well, I mean, typically they're going to be in the ballpark in terms of giving you a preliminary indication of what they think the value is going to be. And I thought they did that on their nickel. So, I probably would kind of start there. Because you know what? While I think it's very valuable for somebody to understand how they can make their business more valuable, maybe you're already there in terms of, hey, it's enough money for me. But if you're not, that's when I think it would be worth paying, whether it's us or whether it's, Viking or whoever. I mean, it's worth paying somebody to say, how can I get more valuable if I'm not happy with where I'm at? But in terms of just, hey, what's your preliminary gut feel based on looking at my tax returns and financial statements? I mean, I actually kind of thought they did that for free. So I would just look at it'd be good to know more about, and whether you do it on the chat or, Gary can share my contact information. You want to follow up more with what they said, I'm happy to help out, one-on-one, but, typically they'll give you, I've seen them. It's a little spreadsheet they put together. It's preliminary indication of value. And that kind of allows you to make the decision on whether or not you want to go forward with selling the business or not, based on, how much money that is. So That's what I would think. I would just find out, am I even in the ballpark of even wanting to sell first, based on their preliminary indication? If the answer to that is no, or even if it's yes, but it could be even so much more if you did X, Y, and Z, that's where it's worth paying some people money. It seems a little preliminary based on your initial question to be paying $5,000 to find out somebody that they can give you like a plus or minus 25%. You just buy them a beer.
Yeah, that's the second time within the last couple of weeks that I've heard. I think I don't remember if the last one was with Viking or if it was with another group, but basically what they told me was they had already paid the fee. And if they backed out of it, then that money was gone. If they consummated the deal, it got refunded, or it just got absorbed into their, percentage of the deal. So I'd ask about that.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to take money out of their pocket. I'm just saying, like, for $5,000, I'm going to expect a report that's got some value drivers, some discussion around how I can increase, like, just stuff, that I would expect beyond a spreadsheet. So that's why it just comes down to what are you actually getting, for that? Because I mean, if you hired a full-blown independent third party, credentialed, basically gonna, bend over, I'm sticking my head in there, I'm gonna go looking around, a little bit. That's gonna be about 3 times that price, $15,000, but it's gonna be a report that you could take to court and it would be defensible in court, and that's not what these guys typically produce. So I just, I would just see what you're actually getting. And I mean, usually they give you kind of at least an initial indication, on them, just as a way of just credentializing themselves.
Yeah, and he just confirmed fee is waived with a signed contract.
Yeah, got it.
I want to bring up something relatedly to that. And this is the kind of after, and let's say that for whatever reason, the term of the engagement has continued. There has not been a transaction. There have been some parties that have been identified, but it hasn't gone anywhere. And so in a different instance with a transaction in the negotiation, and I call it the tail period. So what happens the day of and day after and all the days after termination when you have someone that you've engaged with to help you with the sale of a business? And the most engagement letters out of the gate are very generous to those brokers, which basically says for 1 year, if you have any transaction, then we get a cut of that. And you can see where that is maybe fair in some instances if the information from the perspective of the information and the work that was done put you in a better position to sell your business, albeit it's 6 months or 8 months after the termination of the arrangement. And if nothing else, has educated you and has suggested or made you do things to make your business better in going through that, because most investment bankers want to maximize the purchase price. And so they will say, hey, look, and they'll do some suggestions and say, many of them will say, have you thought about this, or why this says this on your books and you have this expense, why are you doing this kind of thing? And so, and so when I'm ratcheting it back, my first inclination and my revisions back to is that, well, that's fine, but only for if it's someone who has been identified by you to my client, the seller. And that usually isn't where we end up, because, again, you have the knowledge. So you're like, hey, buyer, wink, wink, wait until, the 366th day and then we'll talk. But, in the meantime, let me tell you about all the wonderful things that I've been told about my business. And then we can pick it up as soon as the engagement letter is terminated. So the middle ground, I think, and what has happened in this recent transaction is bifurcate the 12 months. And so, and again, this is not going to work in every instance. It just happened to work in this instance, and I suggested it. And broker. They're up in New York, and they're very sophisticated, and I knew where they were coming from, and they knew where I was coming from. And so the middle ground in this instance was for the first 6 months after termination, any sale, any transaction, asset deal, stock deal, even to family members, because there were some family members that had kind of rights of first refusal, et cetera. So that got accepted. That's not fair. But we worked around that because for other reasons. But for 6 through 12, they had to identify people that were on this list. Or we didn't make a list. We're like, okay, those that are identified at the time of termination. So you go back 6 months, who was identified, and then you kind of really do make a list essentially. And then if a transaction occurs with them, then the fee is earned. And the reason being is that the information possibly gets stale after 6 months or so. And if you have a buyer, they're probably going to want to buy something sooner than later. So to have them wait for 7-8 months, the likelihood of that happening just decreases over the passage of time. And so, and isn't that a fair way if in this case, the seller has their own contacts and may come to the table with someone who was not on that list, or just someone new, or even someone that was on that list. So, it's kind of a compromise and a leap of faith that a seller's not going to say, wait 7 months, and that the investment bankers are still going to get the benefit of the work that they produced in a transaction that occurs after the actual termination. So, and there was a lot more to that story as far as how it all went down. I mean, it was negotiations back and forth and trade-offs here, there. It's like, so assumption of risk by my client and assumption of risk by the broker and vice versa. So, but anyway, there are creative ways to address things like that. So that way it's, I think, a more fair arrangement for both sides. In this instance, we're talking about brokers and their seller clients.
So one of the questions as a follow-up, Adam stated 5 to 8% commissions are typical. This is less than double Lehman.
Yeah. So the way that commission structures are scaled in M&A and investment brokerage is that the percentages are higher at the lower transaction value. So, if you think about it, kind of $1 million, $2 million sales price, you're going to be in that 5 to 8% range. $50 million sales price, you're going to be more in kind of the 3 to 5% range, with some sort of very sexy model around, this bucket is this much, this bucket is this much, this bucket is this much. So these fees typically scale down, meaning get lower based on the transaction size. So the reference to, Lehman being, less than half, I mean, that'd be a true statement. The same thing would apply to, Wells Fargo or another big bank, or, a big, even a local investment brokerage is going to be more like 3 to 5%. But the difference is they're not even going to talk to you unless you've got like 2 million in EBITDA, as a floor value. So, because that's going to translate into a, 10, 15, $20 million transaction versus, $1 million. It's, $1 million enterprise value. It's just, the amount of work is, not too materially different from a $5 million enterprise value. So the fees really scale based on the company valuation. So my 5 to 8% was driven more, around just kind of knowing Vikings, and other business brokers, pricing structure. And they're typically dealing with, kind of that, call it 5 million and below enterprise value. That's their wheelhouse that they do all day long. And that's just a typical rate that you're going to pay at that value. And then that percentage is going to be lower the higher the transaction value.
Yeah, the same thing happens in the wealth management group. I was talking with a buddy of mine this morning, and you may be used to seeing, oh, well, they're charging me 100 basis points to manage my money. Well, PBIG at Merrill Lynch, they're at 35 basis points instead of 100. Well, you have to have 50 million with them, so same sort of thing. Did we address your question, Daryl, on typical model for analysis of anticipated cash flow? Let us know if you had any addition, if Adam covered that adequately, if you had.
Yeah, I probably didn't. So I'm going to give you kind of the generic one, and I'll, if I can stall for a little bit, and then Jack can figure out what the heck he's going to talk about for 5 minutes. I'll post what I'm about to say in the chat as well. But you kind of start with, obviously, what are the gross proceeds, right out of the gate. Then, if you think about it, the easiest way to do this is to think about two columns. Column number one is, what's my taxable gain? So you got gross proceeds, a deduction right after that. It's going to be the brokerage fees, kind of anything that you're going to pay out to the employees is kind of a key, thank you for your service, whatever, and then you're going to have, what's left, and that's going to be your taxable gain. This is assuming, you don't have any basis. I mean, that's going to affect it as well, but that's going to be your taxable gain. You multiply that times the effective tax rate for the transaction. That's your tax expense. On the other side of the column, you're going to kind of follow the same format, which is, gross proceeds, less you're going to have to pay off your debt, but that's not a tax deduction, but you're going to have to pay off your debt. You're going to have to pay out the broker. You're going to have to pay out the employees if you're going to do something with that. And then you're going to have to pay the taxes. And that's going to leave you with your net number that you're going to be able to put in your pocket, assuming that you don't have any earnout or deferred payout associated with it. So, the key difference between those two formulas that gets people hung up on a lot is that, they think that paying off the debt is somehow going to reduce their taxable income. It doesn't. That's not a tax deduction. So that's really the big difference between the two columns. So we usually, when we're running gross proceeds, we usually have what's the taxable gain column, and then we have a what are you actually going to put in your pocket column when we run the analysis.
All right, good, thank you.
And I'm going to add one thing also, and the what you put back, the putbacks into the analysis. So those things that are you as an owner are taking benefits that are perks, whether it is payment for a company car or those kind of things that if it maybe a different owner would not take on as being part of and is a pull on the revenue. So kind of the same thing, but said in a different way. But those are also important too, to acknowledge those things that may increase the value of the company, because it may be something that the new owner doesn't do, which is like maybe provide a car to every family member and cousin and uncle kind of thing.
So I'm just curious, thinking about next week. I mean, we have so much on this M&A stuff that, and it seems like people are still, engaged and interested. I'm wondering, and we're just doing this kind of real time. So if somebody has a thought, hit us up in the chat or the Q&A, but I'm wondering if we do another question or session next week on M&A war stories, but going a little bit deeper into financials, client concentration, the kind of things that we would actually, if we were sitting down with a client and saying, okay, you're looking at wanting to exit, these are the things that we look for, and maybe use some live examples anonymously or whatever. But what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, that's fine. And we actually have a slide for that, Gary. We call it the 7 deadly sins of value destroying. Trademark that, baby. Or something like that. But it's 7 of them.
All
That's
right.
good. And I won't have to talk as much. Adam gets to talk more next time.
Yeah, I'll ramble for a while you can, get your story straight, just like you allowed me to do this time, Jack. I appreciate that.
Okay. All right, cool. So, Daryl, did we give you what you were looking for? It because he said question was more along the lines of working capital formula for the buyer.
Yeah,
but
I'm gonna type that one out now. But it's generically cash plus accounts receivable minus accounts payable. And then the bugaboo that this is assuming that you're not a construction company, you've got over and under billings, but it's cash plus accounts receivable minus accounts payable. And here's the one that always kills people: minus accrued payroll, because most people don't end up using don't accrue for payroll on their valuation. So I will type that in the chat. And then Lonnie, Gary hasn't asked your question yet. Just typed it, but is EBITDA the main driver in the valuation? We own intellectual property in the form of trademarks. So it's a good question. I mean, kind of in theory, if you're a mature business, EBITDA would be an indicator of what that trademark is worth, because the trademark is generating some sort of cash. So if you've got, meaning like, I've trademarked, a piece of software that has my intellectual property in it, and I'm selling that piece of software, the EBITDA should translate into what the underlying value of that trademark is, even if that's not what it's on your balance sheet for. Because on your balance sheet, I'm going to see, Carrie, you're still on the call, so if you correct me if I'm wrong, but what's on your balance sheet is just going to be the capitalized cost of acquiring the trademark, not actually what it's really worth. Unless you acquired the trademark from somebody else, then it's going to be what you paid for it. But if you're valuing a trademark, as an auditor, you're periodically testing to see if that value's been impaired. Well, how are you going to test it? It's basically, is the patent worth anything or not? How do you know if the patent's worth anything or not? Is it associated with a viable product that you can sell and actually make money at? So it always ends up coming back, as much as I hate saying this, because, man, I got something that's really valuable. It doesn't matter if you haven't monetized it. In other words, it's not going to matter to most people unless you figured out how to monetize it. How do I know if I've monetized it? I know if I've monetized it if it's translated into EBITDA. The lone exception that I would give on that would be, if I'm in a business that's a software as a service, and you're kind of trading based off of, annual recurring revenue or subscription-based formula or whatever, that's all great stuff. But at the end of the freaking day, that still needs to translate, like the buyer of that is still translating that into, it needs to generate some cash flow at some point in the future. It can't always be negative cash flow. Otherwise it has no value associated with it. So that's a long, that's a long version of the answer that I think you're looking for there.
Yeah. The one exception to that is, when I was running a company, we'd put $1 million into a competitor during the .com world. They were burning through 40 million a year, 1 million top line, and they sold for $225 million. No joke. And then the .com bubble burst within about 6 weeks of that. Crazy. That was just nuts. But so final question. It was one of the first questions. Think about this one. I don't know. How do we stop our tax dollars being spent on crack pipe giveaways?
Okay, so
I don't know.
Well, I mean, so I also got, look, they had a press conference. They said we're not actually purchasing crack pipes. yesterday, and Marco Rubio evidently is just going to make sure by passing some legislation to make sure we don't buy crack pipes. So no crack pipes have officially
Good.
been purchased yet.
Oh, my
Needles,
goodness.
that's a different story.
We live in some crazy times, man. But we're here to be a little crazy with you, at least try to navigate the craziness. So what you do and being crazy is up to you, but we're going to just try to help you navigate it. So thank you for bringing out the Morse code handbook, Jack and Adam. That was good. So I like the idea of the 7 deadly sins of value destruction. I think we can run with that. So that will be next week. If you missed it or came on late, we will put this up on the YouTube channel, the BGW CPA YouTube channel later on today. Thank you. Great questions. A lot of great questions today. So hopefully we're bringing value. 97 weeks next week. Be here or be square. Thank you so much for your time. Everybody, again, I apologize for being late. We'll be on time next week. See y'all.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Peace out.